In my last video, we talked about the medieval worldview, or at least we started talking about the medieval worldview. We mentioned how the church becomes the center of things during this time period. And I also tried to point out that we got to change the way we think about the Middle Ages. They aren't as backward as many people seem to think they are. A lot of literary endeavors are taking place during this time. There's a culture that's very rich and varied during this time period also. And there is the order that the church does provide during the medieval times. I ended last time talking about a quote from C.S. Lewis in which he talks about how the Middle Ages also had a very interesting view, a harmonizing view of the whole universe and how it all worked together. And I kind of hinted at the fact that it actually wasn't developed out of a biblical way of looking at the universe. It really comes from ancient Greece. It's called the Ptolemaic Universe. But it's something that carried over into the Middle Ages. And the Ptolemaic universe of the Middle Ages would look something like this. Right? As you look here and see how it's laid out, you see the Earth is down there at the bottom. Now, most people say, well, didn't they believe the Earth was the center of all things? Yes, in one sense, but not in the sense most people think. It wasn't the center of all things because it was the most important. It was actually at the bottom of all this, and you look upward from there, and the farther you get away from the earth, the closer to God you are. So in a sense, the earth is the last place you would want to be. The moon is up there, Mercury follows after, Venus, and notice the interesting placement of the sun, which is not at the center with all the planets revolving around it. The sun is out there as one of the revolving spheres around the earth. Mars follows after that, Jupiter and Saturn. And as you can see, some of the others are missing at this point. Well, when we look at the Ptolemaic universe of the Middle Ages, again, we have to understand it in the way that it was understood by the people of the Middle Ages. Lewis actually says this. He says, "You must go out on a starry night, walk about for half an hour, trying to see the sky in terms of the old cosmology. Remember that you now have an absolute up and down. The earth is really the center, really the lowest place, as I mentioned before. Movement to it from whatever direction is downward movement, not go in the right direction. Because the earth is where there is sin. The earth is where there are all these problems. You go up beyond, past the moon, and you're into the areas where God is. Okay? He says, to look up at the towering medieval universe is much more like looking at a great building. And so you were supposed to look up instead. Right? So what do we see here? The spheres transmit, according to the Middle Ages and how they think about these things, what are called influences. Now, we have the word astrology today, and we talk about, astrological signs and these influences and so forth. Well, they thought about that during this time period too, but astrology is not a specifically medieval thing. The Middle Ages inherited it from antiquity. In other words, it comes from the Greeks, the Romans, and other civilizations earlier on as well. So the church during this time period had to think about this and, how do we respond to the idea of influences? Because they did accept the Ptolemaic universe. And so what they had to come up with is the Orthodox theologians, they could accept the theory that planets might have an effect on events and on psychology. But the church fought against three of the offshoots. In other words, there are very specific things that the church would not allow in its teaching when it came to this way of thinking. And the church's critique of astrology is like this. First of all, critique number one. It's against the practice of astrologically grounded predictions. And a lot of times, if you're looking at your horoscope in the newspaper now, that's you're looking to say, what's favorable and how it's going to happen today or in the future or whatever. The church said no. That's not something that we're going to promote here. Critique number two, it was against astrological determinism that could exclude free will. In other words, it's the planets do not determine what you are going to do. Oh yes, there can be an influence from the stars or whatever because the whole universe is filled with life. There's angels, there's all kinds of things out there, but it never, ever excludes your free will. And finally, critique number three, they were against practices that might seem to imply or encourage the worship of planets. So they never gave themselves over to that kind of thinking. They wanted to make sure that the people that they were leading in the culture didn't decide to give their faith to that. Right? What we see here, and again, I'm back to C.S. Lewis because his medieval perspective shows up in so many other things that he wrote. He wrote a science fiction trilogy, the Ransom Trilogy, and the first of that trilogy is called Out of the Silent Planet, in which a man is kidnapped and taken to what we call Mars. It was called Malacandra in that particular book. But what happens is he's in the spaceship and he's out in the heavens, and he suddenly comes to a realization that it's not exactly everything the scientists have told him. His name was Ransom, and he said this, "But Ransom, as time wore on, became aware of another and more spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart as he's in this spaceship going out. A nightmare, long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows in the wake of science, was falling off him. He had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness which was supposed to separate the worlds. Because, science basically tells us today it's empty space out there." Now, he goes on to say this, he had not known how much it affected him till now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for this empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from it every moment. How indeed should it be otherwise, since out of this ocean the worlds and all their life had come? So he sees meaning in the universe. He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly even upon the earth with so many eyes, and here with how many more? Because in space he just saw so much more than he saw on earth. Okay? No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens. Now, some people might think, was C.S. Lewis just trying to revert back to the medieval way of thinking? Does he not understand that science has come up with a different explanation, a more accurate explanation of things? Well, he dealt with that. Matter of fact, though, he wanted to make sure that we understand. And in his Narnia series, in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, he has a little boy by the name of Eustace, who at one point says, "In our world," said Eustace, "a star is a huge ball of flaming gas." But the person that he's talking to in the other world says, "Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of." So there's this distinction that is made here between what a star consists of versus what it is. One doesn't have the meaning, it's just simply a materialistic explanation of a star. The other, where there might actually be some meaning behind the creation. And this is what Lewis says. He said, "Look, I have made no serious effort to hide the fact that the old model, that one we're following here in medieval times, delights me as I believe it delighted our ancestors. Few constructions of the imagination seem to me to have combined the splendor, sobriety, and coherence in the same degree." Okay? It is possible that some readers have long been itching to remind me that it had a serious defect. It was not true. I agree. It was not true. But I would like to end by saying that this charge can no longer have exactly the same sort of weight for us that it would have had in the 19th century. We then claimed, as we still claim, to know much more about the real universe than the medievals did, and hoped, as we still hope, to discover yet more truths about it in the future. But the meaning of the words know and truth in this context has begun to undergo a certain change. As we go back to the structure of what's happening during the Middle Ages, we just got done looking at the cosmology of it. We see the setup. Here are the various churches, let's say, represented in the Middle Ages. Here are people who are over the churches, and they're called bishops. They're over more than one church. They have a certain area they're in charge of. Over the bishops, we end up with a hierarchy where it includes archbishops who are over the bishops who are over the churches. And above the archbishops, eventually what develops out of the Middle Ages is the person at the top who's called the Pope, over the archbishops, over the bishops, over the churches. And so we do have a hierarchy that is set up, and that's one of those things that brings order. In fact, when the Reformation does come along later, one of the big concerns about the Reformation is it's going to dissolve the unity of Christian civilization because everybody's going to kind of go their own way. When we get to the Reformation, of course, we will talk about why it was also important for people to be able to read the Scripture for themselves and make their own decisions about these things. But, there is a truth to the fact that the Christian unity of the time period would be disrupted by that. The Western medieval view of church and state is something that is always a little bit controversial, because who's in charge? We've got the church, we've got the state, and different people are vying for power. And unfortunately, power does become an issue. Now, there are certain things that probably everyone believed during medieval times. First of all, that God's law was sovereign, and everyone needed to go according to God's laws. You could not make up your own. Even a king is under, not above, God's law and civil law. So during the Middle Ages, we did not actually have the concept that comes along later called the divine right of kings, where the king is just suddenly just given all this power by God and no one can question him. That's not the way it is in the Middle Ages. Government officials took an oath to keep the faith. That was something that they had to hold on to. They had to promise this. And their office was valid only if that oath was kept. We also see that they believe that states can crumble, but God's law remains. People are still accountable. So we don't have, like I said, the what develops later with the nation states, with some of these nation states saying this man at the top is everything. We can point actually to one time in church history during this time period of the Middle Ages where there was a debate between the church and the state, and they had to come up with what's called a concordat, an agreement. Took place in the city of Worms in 1122 because there was a big dispute. Who really has the final word here? Is it the Pope or is it the Emperor? In this case of the Holy Roman Empire. They came up with this concept that they decided to live by. Spiritual authority comes from the church, civil authority from the emperor. And so they tried very hard to divide that authority, but there was always going to be some bleed over. And eventually what happens here, a little bit later, a pope by the name of Innocent III decided the following. He said, I believe that God has put me here as the vicar of Christ, and therefore I should be the supreme authority on earth. And it's during Innocent III that we see the height of papal power. He put it this way: the state is related to the church as the moon is related to the sun. Meaning, of course, that the moon only shows up because it gets the radiance from the sun. The state only has any value because it gets its radiance from the church. What's missing here is a separation where the church, and they tried to do it here in this concordat, where the church takes spiritual authority and the emperor has the civil authority. But now we have a pope at this point pretty much saying he should be the final authority. Now, what's happening during this time also, as I've talked about before, in the development of philosophical thinking, theological thinking, we have a movement called Scholasticism, which is the systematic application of reason to revelation. And we see a number of different universities that are set up as a result of this. Bologna, Oxford, Paris, these are some of the early universities. And it's during this medieval time that they are established. And scholasticism, when it takes reason and revelation together, here's the way it works. God's revelation is primary according to the scholastic way of thinking. And then man's reason is subject to God's revelation. It's an attempt to bridge the two and to show that man's reason is significant, but that man always has to make sure his reason is subject to what God has said. The key figure in this scholastic revival during this time period, of revival of education during this time, is Thomas Aquinas, who lived from 1225 to 1274, who could be considered, in what he wrote, the height of scholasticism. And his most famous is the Summa Theologica, which is a systematic exposition of Christian thought that brought reason and revelation together. And so again, I want to emphasize that we're not talking about a time period of barrenness when it comes to thinking, when it comes to trying to figure out how the universe works from a biblical and a reasonable, rational basis. People are working on that. There was somebody else who came along, just after Aquinas. He had a little different point of view on this. William of Ockham is somebody who actually doubted that reason could be used to demonstrate Christian faith. So he was taking a position different from Aquinas in this case. And he said, look, there's no rational basis for Christianity. Faith and belief is separate from reason. And that led to the idea, as time went on, to the study of the world and the study of theology as two very distinct realms, which is going to be an issue as we get into what we call the Enlightenment period at a later time, primarily in the 18th century. No rational basis for Christianity. Okay? You just believe. Do you have to have a solid reason for that belief? Well, Aquinas would say yes. William of Ockham, not necessarily. Okay? Now, what's going to happen here ultimately, I talked about Innocent III as the height of papal power. We have another pope who pretty much decides that he agrees with Innocent III. Boniface VIII from 1294 to 1303 basically said, I am Caesar, I am emperor. That he's supposed to be head of the church. Okay? He came up with a papal bull, as they're called. It was called Unum Sanctum, 1302, in which he said, it is altogether necessary for every human being to be subject to the Roman pontiff. So in this particular papal bull, he's basically saying everybody must obey me. Now, you start putting out things like that, and there's going to be some people who are going to question it. And as we'll talk about in our next video, there were, even during this time period, people like John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, who came forward and said, wait a minute, we don't agree with the direction the church is going. But it took somebody else to come to the forefront to actually make what might be called a reformation. And the rumblings of reform are there, and they're waiting to be seen in a man by the name of Martin Luther. And that's where we'll go next.